Shen Impromptu Poem. I've heard it said, when they garrisoned Yellow Dragon City, that for years on end they never stood down the troops. So sad to think the moon that lit their wives' bedrooms still shines down on their husbands in their camps. Spring comes and their wives' sadness grows. At night, men too think of their wives at home. What general among us can pick up drums and banners and take that dragon city so this war can end? Okay, so here we have a regulated poem by Shen. Now, as we've mentioned before, this section of the 300 Tang poems is mainly including writers from the early Tang period. The one we read yesterday was Du Shenyang, and the next one in the list is going to be Song Jiwen. Now, both Shen Chuanqi and Song Jiwen usually appear referenced together in Chinese literary histories as Song and Shen, probably because they were the most representative, or taken to be the most representative poets of a certain part of the early Tang period. They both served under Empress Wu. They both occupied relatively important positions and were followers, or at least part of the artists under the patronage of one of Empress Wu's favorites. When that favorite fell from power in 705, both Shen and Song were exiled to the remotest areas of the empire in punishment. Shen Chuanqi managed to make it back and to end his life in relative peace. Song Jiwen was not so lucky. He continued conspiring, and Emperor Xuanzong, when he became emperor, ordered him to commit suicide. So both of these poets, as we say, are very representative of the early Tang poetry, but a special characteristic, as explained by some critics, of these two, of Shen Chuanqi and Song Jiwen, is that, at least in some aspects, they started to break from the hold that the period of the Shuni and the Six Dynasties poetry had until then, until the middle, late 7th century, had kept that stranglehold on Chinese poetry. Two aspects mainly. The first one is that these are the first two poets which have a relatively big production in the New Tang style of poetry, in this regulated poem format, in Lu Shi verse. Besides that, one of the ways in which they started to abandon some of the characteristics of the Six Dynasties poetry was in their attempt at infusing the new Shi poetry with subject matter that came from other areas, from other genres of poetry. And I think we can see that very well in this poem. So this poem has the title Impromptu Poem. We may imagine it was an improvisation, and this is also very typical of early Tang poetry. It was composed in courtly settings. It was composed in banquets between friends and scholar officials. So a lot of the poetry was social convention poetry, created, on the go. So by that very nature, it couldn't be, most of its exemplars would not be very, very deep, or they would be quite conventional in form and in subject matter. But I was saying, one thing that we can see in this poem by Shen Chuanqi that points to these thematic innovations of the Shi form, or at least of this new regulated verse form, is the influence of ballads, for example, in this case. So this poem that I have read to you, if I hadn't told you beforehand that it was a regulated poem, a Lu Shi, you might perfectly well have taken it to be one of the ballads that we read about in the past. So the topic of this poem is warfare. It gives the typical negative view of warfare in the Chinese tradition, like the soldiers slaving away at the front, growing old for a long time, being sad, their wives and relatives at home being sad and crying for them. A last rhetorical question at the end: when will a general come to put an end to this horrible war? So it could perfectly well be because of the subject matter, a joyful poem, a ballad. But it's not. It's a regulated poem. It's a lushi. So we've already mentioned the topic or the main idea, the main topic of the poem, which is describing warfare in the remote provinces. I'm not sure where this Yellow Dragon City is. I have to check it up. But I imagine it would have been probably in the western regions, some of the areas that had an urban population and where the Tang Dynasty led some military campaigns during its early period. So the poem is about warfare. It describes a siege of a city, Yellow Dragon City. It's a very long siege that takes many years. The soldiers sigh, wishing to return home. Their wives at home sigh, wishing to go with them. So warfare, the horrors of warfare, is the topic of the poem. Warfare from a negative light. The shared moon and separation, parting. This is again something we've encountered in lots of poems. People who are separated look at the same moon and feel a slight compensation from this, like, okay, we are separated by thousands of miles, but we're both looking at the same moon. It somehow joins us together. And yeah, I think that's the main idea, or those are the main ideas that are developed in this poem, which is from what I've said and what you can gather, pretty conventional. So let's go couplet by couplet as usual. I've heard it said, when they garrisoned Yellow Dragon City, that for years on end they never stood down the troops. So the poet starts speaking about something, an anecdote, a story he heard about a city where troops were sent and where those troops were not allowed to go back, were given no permits. So horrible war. From the couplet itself, it doesn't seem too clear if the soldiers are going to garrison the city, that is to defend it from barbarian attacks, or if the soldiers are meant to be attacking it. I think the conclusion of the poem, which we will talk about in a minute, does seem to point to this campaign against Yellow Dragon City to be a sort of siege. But this wasn't that clear in the first couplet. We continue. So sad to think the moon that lit their wives' bedrooms still shines down on their husbands and their camps. So it's the same moon that the soldiers are looking at, sleepless at night in their encampments, is the same moon that their wives, far away in China, are looking at night, sleepless because they miss their beloved husbands. Spring comes, and their wives' sadness grows. At night, men too think of their wives at home. So this couplet hammers in the previous idea. Not only are both husbands and wives under the same moon, they're both longing to reunite with their beloveds. Spring is the season, I think we've mentioned it in other poems, is the season of happiness, of renewal, of freshness, of love. But many Chinese poems take it as a starting point for a negative description of feelings. Why? Because they reflect an antithesis, a contrast between the eternal renewal of spring. Every year it follows the same cycle and of its love, and the non-renewal of human love, because we, as opposed to nature, we grow old, and many years of separation from a beloved person means that you might never return at all, or when you return you will be old and weak. So spring is doubly poignant because it contrasts the renewal, the perpetual renewal of love and spring in nature as opposed to in human lifetime. And because it's the season of love, it makes the absence of the beloved ones doubly felt, because now is the time for love. But anyway, both the women and the men, at day and at night, lament the absence. And the poem ends with, as I've already mentioned, a sort of a clarion call, rhetorical demand for a general that might be able to put an end to this pointless and long-lasting campaign. What general among us can pick up drums and banners and take that dragon's city so this war can end? Is there any general able enough to do this? So this is Shen Quanqi's poem. Not bad, pretty conventional, as I've said. And the topic harks back to the topics of the ballads that we've read previously. I think there is another poem by Shen Quanqi in this anthology, but if there is, there's only one more. I think in the heptasyllabic regulated poems section. So it will be interesting to contrast that one with this one when we get there.